Thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Rutledge Simmons, General Counsel at NeighborWorks America. I want to introduce Maurice Jones, who is the President and CEO of LISC, Local Initiatives Support Corporation. They support projects to revitalize communities and create greater economic opportunity. Prior to that, he served as Secretary of Commerce, Commonwealth of Virginia, Deputy Secretary for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Commissioner for Virginia's Department of Social Services and Deputy Chief of Staff to former Virginia Governor Mark Warner. Mr. Maurice Jones.
I should just stop if I get applause already. I didn't say thank you. Well, it's nice to, but we just did a podcast together, so this is actually the first time we're meeting face to face. So thanks.
But not voice to voice.
Not voice to voice. That's right. And I have a face for radio, so it's a little different. How many of you know LISC in the audience? I'm just curious. Oh yeah, you all know LISC. So, all right. Well, this should be easy then. So let me start with, we have offices, LISC does, in 35 metropolitan areas, and then we work in about 2,000 counties, 2,100 counties in 44 states. And what we principally do is provide financing for housing, for workforce development, for business development, safety issues, comprehensive community development efforts. In every place where we work, the legacy of federal and state and local policy is apparent. Race and culture are intertwined with all the problems that we're trying to solve. No question about it. And you can drive in any city in America practically, and you can see how through purposeful placement of highways and avenues and roads and railroad tracks, communities were segregated intentionally. No question about it. Now, the interesting thing is, I think too many of us don't stop to reflect, to internalize that fact. And so I'm grateful for this information coming out that was just discussed, because more and more communities need to grapple with how they've gotten to where we are today as one of the first ways that they can mobilize a coalition of folks of goodwill, multiracial, multi-generational, multi-sector, to address these issues. And more we see places doing that. But I was in Charlottesville, Virginia recently, where I went to school, and they were giving me a tour of the public housing projects in various places, and it is unbelievable. One of the, if you got to know Charlottesville to really appreciate this, but one of the developments is literally a stone's throw away from Main Street. But the only way you get there is by going down a road up under the railroad tracks and around, and you can literally, and it's completely isolated, completely physically isolated from Main Street, where commerce, and you can literally see Main Street from looking up the hill. But the only way you can get there is to go underneath the railroad tracks through a road that was built and back out to Main Street. there's no way that that can happen except for intentional. Right? That doesn't naturally happen. And there are stories like that everywhere. So we work to try to both invest in the people in these communities, to help the people in these communities develop the kinds of skill sets, work-wise and hopefully assets-wise, that give them opportunities to move if they desire to do so, to get jobs of livable wages. And we're talking about, in a lot of cases, working with largely African Americans and other individuals of color who may have a GED or high school diploma, but when tested are, and this is a symptom of school challenges, are reading and doing mathematics at somewhere between the 6th and 8th grade in competencies. And we try to work with community-based assets to help them get to 10th grade competencies in 30 weeks in order to get them into programs that can result in certifications and licensing and medical assistance and the kinds of things that hopefully will enable them to get jobs regionally that will allow them to make livable wages and give them more mobility. Tough work, but work that has to be done in every community where we're living or where we're working. Housing was mentioned, and the housing piece that we see very often in most places is a combination of an inadequate supply of affordable housing for people at various income levels, whether it's earning 30% of area median income and on the verge of homelessness to, frankly, earning 150% of area median income and without help cannot really afford to be homeowners or afford to rent in a lot of our cities around the country, to everything in between. And we finance the facilitation or the acquisition or the development and preservation of that kind of housing to a challenge that's becoming more and more prominent, which is how you keep people in their housing in communities that are gentrifying. Gentrification, we all want that. The question is how you do it without displacement. And that is, I think as was mentioned, there are ways to do it. There's no question that you can do it, but it is a challenge in every city now practically that we're working in. And the displacement is not just of people from their homes or businesses from their commercial facilities. It's also displacement of culture. And all of that is work that we are attempting to be helpful in. And so trying to invest in place, my view on this place issue is, yes, you have to do more to give people opportunities to have mobility about the places where they work and live and raise families. But you also have to do more to invest in the places where people are to help the trajectory of that place improve as well. That it is a false argument to be arguing whether you do one or the other. The bottom line is you have to do both. And we have the resources in this country to do both if we conjure the will. And so we spend a lot of time working on those places that are disinvested and that are underinvested, trying to improve them. A couple other things, and then I'm gonna stop. I'm not sure if this is what I'm supposed to be talking about or not.
Oh, no, get it in, get it in.
I figure I can do it. Nobody stopped me yet, right? Another manifestation of this whole segregation and housing issue is pick any city practically in America. I'll pick Richmond, Virginia. I worked there for quite a while. I used to work in the Capitol building in downtown Richmond. And I could drive 10 minutes to the east of the Capitol building, and I would be in a census tract or in a neighborhood where the life expectancy would be 69 years old. I could then go 10 minutes to the west of downtown Richmond, and I could be in a census tract in a neighborhood where the life expectancy is 89. That community to the east is going to be African American. That community to the west is going to be white. That is a story or a narrative you can tell in every community in the country, practically. Boston has the highest discrepancy I've seen in life expectancies, 33 years between the lowest life expectancy census tract and the highest. And you can tie this back not to access to health care, which is what we debate about in this country the most, which is what we spend the overwhelming bulk of our time debating. But 80% of it is the conditions under which people are living, right? It is the housing. It is the lack of jobs. It is the stress. It is the absence of playing fields for youth that can cause ultimately or contribute to diabetes and hypertension. There is no question in my mind that segregation is a big piece of this. So we are spending a fair amount of time trying to engage hospital systems and others to get at these issues that are determining or that are contributing to this life expectancy gap that the country has. Ultimately, to do this stuff at scale, though, requires policy changes. No question about it. We got here primarily through the power of the scale of public policy. We will make significant progress only if the power of the scale of public policy is attempting to remedy these challenges. Private policy too, but there's no question we do a lot of investing. We invest in places all over the country, but the way to actually tackle this stuff effectively and sustainably at scale across the country, urban and rural, the most powerful tools are still public policy. And so back to the point that was made, unless we conjure up the political power to do these changes, to make these remedies, to take these actions that we need at scale, we will always fall short. I was trying to explain this to my daughter's. I spoke at my daughter's high school on this, and one person said to me, one of the students said, "Look, we've eliminated all the discriminatory laws that we used to have on the books now." And so isn't everything fixed, right? Which was a reasonable question and is certainly a point of view that people have. And I said to her, look, it's like being in a race, right? And the gun goes off and there are people 5 miles back from the starting line and they don't win the race. You know why they didn't run the race. It doesn't matter how fast they run. They started 5 miles back. The question is what we do as a country to address the person, the community, the legacy of having people start 5 miles back in a race. Still the most powerful tools we have are public policy for that. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. Ms. Lorraine Collins is the Director of Public Policy and External Affairs, New York, for Enterprise Community Partners, the New York office. She's been working with the office's executive team and program leaders to build and effectively execute a public policy strategy to address affordable housing and community development issues. She has spent over a decade with the New York State government working on affordable housing policy at Homes and Community Renewal in the Division of Budget. And as Director of Policy Advisor, she has led efforts to address affordable housing and community development needs. Ms. Lorraine Collins.
Thank you. Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. I've broken up my comments into 3 different primary sections. Section on reflection, so reflecting on my experience with the color of law, and then a little education in terms of being able to share with you all what Enterprise Community Partners is doing in this space, particularly as it relates to race. And then also ending with a section on a call to action. So reflecting on some of the work that we're doing, particularly in more recent months, and really bringing this call to action to the Mid-Hudson and energize and make sure that you're aware of some of the energy that's taking place, not only in the New York City metro region, but also across the state. I hope Guy and Kevin do not count this against my 11 minutes, but I do want to really thank you again for this opportunity. As I was sitting and listening to Kevin's opening remarks, and he's talking about when he first heard Richard and really wanting to bring him here to have this conversation here in the Hudson Valley, it reminded me of when I was with the state government and we created the Fair and Equitable Housing Office. RUPCO was one of the first organizations that raised their hands to say, we want your staff to come here and train our entire staff on fair housing. And so I think that speaks to not only how serious he is about this topic, not only from the perspective of race, but when we look at all protected classes, and the work that RUPCO can do to be a light, again, not only in the Hudson Valley region, but throughout the state. So I commend you, Kevin, for your work. So my color of law experience, I'm not sure where Richard went, but it was my first audiobook. So that was, oh, there you are. So that was interesting to experience such rich history through an audio and be able to play back. Oh my goodness, I can't believe you said that. And play it back again, and then play it back again. But for me, being in the affordable housing industry for a decade or more, it really brought different pieces of history that I was aware of, some of which I wasn't aware of, nicely together, I thought, and really give individuals an opportunity to think and reflect on, you know, how did we get to this space where we are as a country when we think about particularly organizations such as Enterprise, LISC, and other partners, when we're looking at the communities that we're serving, particularly those in urban areas, why do certain neighborhoods look the way they do? And having colleagues over time take a lot for granted and not really being even aware of the history. So I really appreciated how the book really brings this history together. Also from a reflection perspective, thinking about the integration versus segregation debate. And some people have strong opinions on one side, and some people have strong opinions on the other. As a resident of Central Brooklyn, which I believe is probably the epicenter or one of the many epicenters in New York City of gentrification, it really, you know, it shifts depending on the day, because we see how with gentrification we do have integrated neighborhoods, but through that integration it's really just bringing groups of people together and not looking at or considering how, when those groups of people are brought together, how do we then make for community? And to me, I think that is the true essence of integration and what we should be striving for. What I'm often seeing is that odds with people who have been in communities for generations feeling as though not only are they being pushed out, but if they have the opportunity to stay, that their history, their culture, as you mentioned, Maurice, is being wiped away. And they no longer recognize the neighborhood that oftentimes was the only neighborhood that their families were able to live in. So being mindful of that and looking at it from the development perspective with a both-and approach. So we have the conversation about where are we developing the affordable housing? Do we abandon urban investment just to develop in the areas of opportunity, or how do we create areas of opportunity in those disinvested communities? So it became, for me, a conversation of choice, a conversation of investment, and also combating racist policies. From the perspective, someone had raised the conversation of reparations and what does that mean. I can't speak for all Black people, but for myself, I'd like the tokens, the policies, and enforcement. If we could package those all very nicely. But also, you know, one of my reflections touches on another comment that was raised in terms of, you know, the what now. What does this mean for advocacy when you have books such as Color of Law, Evicted, Family Properties, Race, Real Estate, and Exploitation of Black Urban America? It would be great if these great authors, these great minds who've brought this history out to have what I noted as a Tom's movement or a Tom's mindset. So if anyone's familiar with the shoe brand Tom's, they have a one-for-one policy. So the concept was we sell a pair of shoes, we give a pair of shoes, and how that organization has even transpired and say no longer is one-for-one enough. We have to move more towards advocacy and have to move more towards investment. So if we could see this conversation really moving more towards how do we now advocate with all this rich information that we have? And then how do we turn that advocacy into true investment in all communities? So enterprise. The topic of racial equity has really been strong within the organization over the last couple of years. Internally, we are working with a racial equity working group both at the national level as well as at the New York market office level and several of the New York or several of the market offices across the nation. And what's happened is it really is an awakening of the affordable housing industry, I believe, to reflect on not only what's happening externally, but how are organizations structured? How is it that you can look across an organization and you know, if you're lucky, 15% of your executives are people of color. In most instances, that number runs around, you know, 10 to 15. So what we've been doing is really starting to assess and have that inward scope of what changes can we begin to make? How can we normalize the conversation of racial equity? What does it mean for us within the organization so that we can then turn that outward? We've been engaged in a number of activities. The first that I highlight is through our consulting arm known as Enterprise Advisors. For those of you who are familiar with Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, in 2015 being a great year in Washington, and then things sort of changed a couple years later. Nevertheless, it's really been encouraging for our organizations to see and work with communities that are still invested in going through the analysis, going through the research, having the community engagement conversations to put fair housing plans together and really start to think through and work through what changes do we need to make within our city, what changes do we need to make within our city in certain neighborhoods. And so our advisors team provides technical assistance. They've gone from working on assessment for fair housing to back to the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, but with communities really across the nation. So again, one of my point to call to action for those entitlement jurisdictions that are in the Hudson Valley, don't allow what's happening in Washington to deter you from taking that extra step to say, hey, we have some issues, we have some concerns when we drive around our cities, we see things that maybe shouldn't be, or even question how did they come to be, and what can we do to really move in a different direction. Another initiative that I wanted to highlight is an initiative that's taking place in a few key market offices across the nation. This is being done in collaboration with a few key partners, those being the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, the Low Income Investment Fund, or LIF, and the National Resource Defense Council. And what the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, say that 5 times fast, is really doing is allowing or forcing us to rethink how do we look at investment and how does that investment really impact a community. And so as part of this SPARK process, what's taking place in the cities across the nation is looking at once a development site has been noted or identified, how do we take that address, run it through a screen or a survey of questions, and then produce what impact does this particular investment or would this particular investment have within this community? And how do we then use that information to make certain decisions as we move forward? And so being able to not only have an impact in the communities that we're currently working in, but how does that then relate to, can we expand that conversation or that process to, again, not only think about what we're doing in terms of a single development, but what impact are we having on communities, what impact are we having on the lives of people, not so much just the brick and mortar, but the full aspect of their lives, the health components, when we look at what's happening with climate change, when we're looking at what's happening with the economic mobility and economic wealth discussions as well. After you've read The Color of Law, I encourage everyone in this room to go to an enterprise market near you and experience the Undesign the Red Line exhibit. Actually, our colleagues in Los Angeles had an invitation out to Richard, and he was able to participate in what was a dynamic discussion and experience. What Undesign the Red Line is, really, the group that created this, Designing the We, they're really a social impact, social-minded design studio. And what they've done was brought the redlining history to life. Not only with maps where you're able to see in certain communities how different neighborhoods were zoned or redlined, but also the real life stories from those communities that tells of the experience. What happened? What was the feeling in the 1930s? How does that now transpire to what we see today? The Undesigning the Red Line experience started for enterprise in our New York market office a few years ago. Since then, we have been in 8 of our market offices, some of which I've highlighted. And each experience is different. The amount of time that the exhibit stays is a matter of how long the particular office might want to either have a focused conversation, or if it's a matter of inviting community members in to tour and then take that information back to their respective organizations. What it has done, now that we're a few years in, is like, how do we move beyond just the education component? So we are now enlightened. We've read Color of Law. We've seen Color of Law actually come to life in some instances in walking through the Undesign the Red Line exhibit. And so now we talk about the what now. What are we all willing to do to change what has become? And it has to be more than just the lip service. We cannot or can no longer be satisfied with just the regular conversation and the fact that we are now enlightened. And so that's where all of our market offices are now. Some of those who have had the exhibit for months. For New York, we had it a few years ago. We were the first, and now the exhibit is back. And that's our focus now, is the what now. So individuals who experienced the exhibit 3 years ago, what changed? If nothing changed, there's a problem. For those who are experiencing the exhibit for the first time, what does this motivate you to do? So again, I encourage you to go on Designing the We's website. You can have the Undesign the Red Line online exhibit, but we currently have the exhibit in the New York market office, and I encourage you all to make the trek down to the city. It will be well worth it. It's an emotional experience going through the history, but it's real, and it's something that should prompt action. In October of 2017, Enterprise Community Partners co-convened a regional affordable and fair housing roundtable with the Fair Housing Justice Center. What we think is certainly the first of its kind in the state of New York. We were able to bring together affordable housing, fair housing, community development, a number of other related industry or sector individuals together for a one-year journey. And what that journey entailed was cross-educating on affordable housing and fair housing in particular, because oftentimes those two sectors have been at odds with one another as opposed to working together. And what we wanted our end result to be was a shared policy goal, a shared policy agenda that we could work not only throughout the New York City metro region, but also statewide. And if there were policy recommendations that raised to the federal level, at the federal level as well. Closing the Divide is the end result of our initial work that we've done. Within this document, we not only highlight what our journey was like over the year, but we also have a list of policy recommendations that touch, again, not only what we're able to do in the city of New York, but when we look at the suburban counties of Westchester, Nassau, and Suffolk, what are policy priorities that we can highlight or that we have highlighted that touch on tenant protection, that touch on inclusionary zoning, that touch on the development or lack thereof of multifamily housing, and how do these conversations, again, work not only from a race base, but when we are looking at all protected classes, particularly those of race matters, those that are of disability. And so with this report, what we're now doing is within the policy recommendations, some were actively moving forward with, but for our year two, we want to have the opportunity to reflect and ensure that those recommendations are moving forward, that we have organizations that are working either as part of a coalition or maybe taking the lead independently initially, doing additional research on some of our policy recommendations that weren't as fully fleshed out, but that we are moving forward. And this is one of the parts of the call to action, again, bringing to the Hudson Valley to encourage you to, if you haven't already done so, bringing these different types of groups together, being able to have conversations about what's happening across the region, how can you work together to, again, impact those policy changes, and then what's also occurring in other parts of the state where we can have a broader voice. And finally, the cat was out the bag. I thought I was going to be the first to mention to Richard the success here in New York State with the amendment of the New York State Human Rights Law to include source of income as a protected class. In December of 2017, Enterprise, along with Erase Racism, Fair Housing Justice Center, New York Housing Conference, led a statewide source of income coalition. Our campaign, we labeled in 2018, #Ban Income Bias NY. And we worked very hard throughout the 2018 state legislative session, trips to Albany, trips to district offices, educating elected officials, educating even partners to make sure that they were aware, particularly in those areas of the state where those protections didn't currently exist, being able to share with them why this is important, how this is impacting communities across the state. And so our work continued throughout the summer and then right into the 2019 legislative session. Of course, we can't take all credit for the success, and we really commend our state legislators and the governor for ensuring that this was included in the 2019-2020 enacted budget. But the work just begins. So the laws are on the books, but we know laws can be on the books, but if they aren't enforced, then nothing changes. And so our campaign and coalition will now begin to shift, where we're talking more about education. How do we educate tenants about their rights? How do we educate property owners, realtors, and others about what their roles and responsibilities are? And then also, how do we move towards resources for official enforcement that would really make a change and make a difference across the state. So with that, I will conclude and pass on.
All right, thank you. Kathleen Tobin is Deputy Director, Benjamin Center, SUNY New Paltz. She designs, manages, and produces projects focused on regional issues and concerns. She serves on the Village of New Paltz Affordable Housing Board. She's also an adjunct lecturer in sociology, teaching an introduction to sociology, social inequality, and research methods. Ms. Tobin.
Am I? Okay.
Sorry, Richard.
PowerPoint fear there for a second. Hi, thank you so much for having me here today and to be a part of this discussion. My job is to bring this back all home and to talk about, really not talk about, to present to you the lay of the land and some statistics that shouldn't be surprising, but when we see them, we realize the extent of the challenges ahead, and that everything that we've been talking about today, this is us. Like, this is happening to us, has happened to us, is happening right here, and we have a lot of work to do to change course from this history. So thank you so much, Kevin and Guy, for inviting me to be a part of this. They asked me to show you some statistics. So I'm looking at 3 Mid-Hudson counties, Dutchess, Orange, and Ulster. I'm going to provide for you racial composition statistics as well as differences in home ownership versus people who are tenants, as well as some public opinion survey about perceptions from those different standpoints. So in this little 3-county Mid-Hudson subregion that I looked at just for this presentation, we are definitely overwhelmingly white, 83%, 9% black, 8% another race, and the counties are very similar, but Orange County is a little higher with 11% having the highest percent of black households, and Ulster at the lowest with 4%. When we look just overall at home ownership and rental rates, 69% of the, and sorry, we had some PowerPoint problems. The owner occupied, which is homeowners, is the orange, and tenants are the lighter color. So in the 3 counties, 69% of households are owner occupied, 31% are rentals, and there's not a lot of variation at all across the 3 counties. If we look at delving a little bit down into our cities, and actually, technically, they're small cities. We don't have big cities in our region. We have small cities. We see it's a little bit different when you look at the difference between the households in our 6 small cities, Beacon and Poughkeepsie and Dutchess, Middletown, Newburgh, and Port Jervis in Orange County, and Kingston and Ulster County. We see that and by the way, that's only 15% of everybody in these 3 counties live in the 6 cities, but we see that in the cities, home ownership rate is about 45%, whereas it's much higher in the towns where it is at 74%. And there's more black households in the small cities. 23% of the households in the cities are black households compared to 6% in the towns. So that's a settlement pattern that shouldn't be surprising based on everything that we're talking about today. There is some variation across these cities. Newburgh and Poughkeepsie are comprised of about 1/3 black households. The average is 23%, Middletown is 22%, and the other cities are less than 20%. When we look at home ownership and rental rates, in just the 60 towns where there's 74%, we see a difference in white and black households. We see that white households are 63% homeowners, and this is just the towns now. 44% of black households are owner occupied. If we then look at the cities, we see that home ownership rates are lower overall, lower than the county averages and in the towns. And we see that white households being homeowners drops to 54%, but it's still a majority, and it's still higher than black households, where only 29% of black households in our small cities are owner-occupied. The black homeowner rate does vary across the cities, with Poughkeepsie and Newburgh, the two cities with the highest percentages of black populations, having the lowest rates of black homeownership, 21% and 18%. We just finished up, it was a long project that's going to be released this summer about the cost of living in our region, and I took a look at some of the questions related to affordability and people's perception of affordability, and I broke it down by white and black homeowners, white tenants and black tenants, and you can see that this is a question just generally, do you view your community as affordable? And we can see that homeowners definitely view their communities as more affordable than tenants. We can see that housing costs stress out all households. There's a standard metric in affordable housing that if you're spending more than 30% of your income to pay for your mortgage or your rent, that's going to stress you out. So if we look at these households, we can see that nearly half, 48% of white homeowners, and majorities of all the other groups, 54% of black tenants, 62% of black homeowners, and 77% of white renters need to use more than 30% of their income to pay for their housing. And we also see that even when you're a homeowner, about a third of those populations are living paycheck to paycheck. But we see double those numbers amongst our tenants, really stressed out, living paycheck to paycheck, white tenants 66%, and black tenants 74%. And then we also asked, if you lost all sources of income, how long would that last with the money that you have saved? And we see that 85% of white renters and 94% of black tenant households have less than 6 months saved to live on if they lost all sources of income. So those are statistics derived from census as well as public opinion surveys. I did, after reading the book, started thinking about other studies that we did at the Benjamin Center. And this is just a couple examples to try to tie this to what's happening here at home and policies. We recently, last year, released a report how the tax lien system in the city of Poughkeepsie disproportionately creates a situation where black and Latinx households and older households lose their houses at much higher rates, and talk about political will. This seemingly sort of small policy, not small to these people that have lost their homes. There's some folks on the Poughkeepsie City Council right now that are trying to change this policy, and it's a huge lift. Also, we've looked at the statistics that I showed you so far show you the segregation across our towns and our small cities, and then it happens within those small cities as well, right? So we have, took a look at Poughkeepsie, and if you're from around here, you're familiar with 4455 and the arterial. Well, the arterial was a policy decision, right? A land use decision, and it starkly divides Poughkeepsie. To the north is predominantly African-American population. To the south, it's mostly white. And actually, if you take that census tract, that white census tract out of the city of Poughkeepsie, the poverty statistics in Poughkeepsie would be so much worse than they even already are. I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation. I find myself, because of my work, I have the privilege of being in a lot of spaces where, whether it's economic development folks or it's environmental folks, that we need to revitalize our small cities. We need to revitalize our small cities. And I find myself a lot of times saying, well, who are we doing that for? And the people that are here are really struggling. And there's not any panacea that we're just going to bring people up from Brooklyn to live in Kingston and Poughkeepsie and Middletown and fix our problems. And I think we have a ethical and moral responsibility to take care of the people that are already here. And that's why I'm glad to be part of this conversation. So thank you for having me here.
I'm going to pose maybe a couple of questions to the panel, but before I do that, I want to know if Mr. Rothstein wants an opportunity to respond to anything he's heard.
Well, I've certainly had enough chance this afternoon to run my mouth, and you know what I have to say. I think the panelists are very interesting, but I don't think I need to take up time doing that now.
All right, thank you. So, one question you alluded to in your opening remarks regarding the short-term housing issue versus the long-term play in terms of how we move this forward. You've emphasized integration as a solution, not only, well, in large part around our education policies. That would be the purpose of integration. We've had a debate in the community regarding, placement of light-tech housing and bringing communities up, distressed communities. So I guess generally to the panel, as you've read this book and it's laid out the case, how has it informed your thinking regarding the types of solutions we would want to pursue aggressively, concurrently, to address the integration issue as well as the current short-term issues, but not losing sight of the long-term solutions?
Me?
Open it. It's open. Oh, it's open.
I can't
Ladies
go
first?
before that. My grandmother would kill me if I went first.
And I'll be brief, but as I mentioned during my comments, really in taking the book in and reflecting on the color of law, also having in the back of my mind, Warmth of Other Suns, Evicted, all these great books that have brought such good history together. One of the things that I appreciate that the color of law raises, particularly around mobility, because I think with mobility, that also speaks to, again, people having a choice. And so I may choose to remain in the community that I'm in because that's where my network is, that's where I'm employed, that's where my children are comfortable, my spouse is comfortable. But I also think that with mobility, it gives that choice. If I should choose not to remain where I am, I don't have policies, bigotry, other items that are being thrown at me to limit that. And I think it's those little nuggets that we can start to really mobilize using the source of income victory. How do we then turn that into increasing the amounts that vouchers are able to attract, the different housing stock? How does that also relate to community conversations that really need to take place? Again, I go back to this notion of we can't just bring people together and think we're going to have a harmonious kumbaya moment with those policies that have segregated communities. And people have chosen to remain or to go to those segregated communities also over generations. And so to have an influx of people who do not look like white folks who may be in suburban communities, that's a culture change. And I think that's something that should be addressed on both sides, both those who are the existing residents and then residents who are coming, because you don't want to be in a situation where after a year or after a couple of years, that family who had the Section 8 voucher, who used that to mobilize themselves and go into a more integrated community or attempt to integrate a community, that they just retreat back because there wasn't a sense of welcoming or it didn't turn out to be a better situation for their family.
There's so many things that we have to do. We can't think that there's one thing that we have to do, right? I wanted to mention, like right now in Albany, they're talking about, there's a renewal of the rent control. I can't remember the name of the act, but basically rent control is possible in New York City and the suburbs surrounding it. And now that legislation is up for renewal, and we have an opportunity in New York State to at least allow communities to opt into rent control. So I think that focus on Albany and New York is really important to see what they're doing. And, you know, we've had a sea change in our legislature, so we need to jump on those opportunities, and they've been busy. But in my own local community, where I also serve as deputy mayor and have been on the Affordable Housing Board for a while, you know, we have the only affordable, to my knowledge, according to Guy Kemp, the only affordable inclusionary zoning loan law in the region, whereby developments of 10 units or more have to be 10% affordable. And that's great, and I'm glad that we're doing it, but it's gonna barely move the dial. And I get pushback all the time from constituents, and I'm like, yeah, but every little place that we can, we have to take action. So I'm gonna do it here, and 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 we need to just cobble this together. But I think the beauty of a book like The Color of Law is, again, and I really liked hearing about the intersection of your work with education, because I do a lot of work on critiquing education reforms coming out of Albany and DC as well. We have amnesia in this country because we just, you know, you were talking about your kid, I think my kid in the 3rd grade said, did Martin Luther King fix all this, you know? In a progressive, oh, you would love to make fun of smug little New Paltz town, you know? And we just have to keep, you know, that's why I'm so grateful to present these statistics, as horrifying as they are to me. Like, people don't know. So we have to talk about it more, and we have to expand awareness of the challenges, because if you don't know where you are, you can't really move that dial.
Well, you know, for 70 years in this country, we have said that we should do both, mobility and place-based strategies. That's been the mantra of every policy expert, every housing advocate in the country. But in practice, we don't do both. We give lip service to mobility and put our efforts in the place-based strategies for the simple reason, as I said earlier, it's easier, and we can accomplish more because we have less resistance, less political opposition. And by putting the same effort into both, it's inevitable going to be that the same effort is going to produce more on the place-based, not enough, obviously. Nobody suggests we've done enough, but it's going to have more results on the place-based strategies than on the mobility strategies. So I think we have to be careful when we say we should do both, because in practice we need to do more effort on the mobility if we're really going to do both. The second thing I'd like to say is that there are costs to redressing segregation. It's not a cost-free effort. You know, we all know that when we eliminated segregated schools in the South, black teachers lost their jobs. Many black administrators lost their jobs. Some people say maybe we shouldn't have desegregated schools. Do we really believe that? There was a real cost to be paid for doing that. Finally, I want to come back to the point I made earlier. Cultural homogeneity is a good thing, but preserving our democracy is also a good thing. And I don't think that we can preserve our democracy in an apartheid society. And that's, I think, the choice that we have to face when we examine the balance between these kinds of policies.
You know, a couple things. One, it's interesting to hear Richard say that conservatives embrace the book because it shows how screwed up government is. In my mind, the book is exhibit A of how effective government can be. Right? I mean, it worked. Right?
Absolutely.
It worked. So I'm looking at it going, no, public policy can actually, it just depends on what you're trying to get done. But you can get a job done. We've segregated a country. That ain't no small undertaking. And so from my standpoint, one of the humble lessons that the book reminds us of is just how important it is in a country now where narratives and facts aren't always brought together, to put the facts and the stories together, to make sure that the stories actually reflect the facts. And I am still naive enough to believe that it can move people to actually come together to try to make us, in truth, a more perfect union. And so I think the more we can tell this story, the better. And the more informed we become across the country in urban and rural settings, the better the work that we're trying to do will be, with full acknowledgement that this is a marathon, that we're going to be at this for a while. Then the second thing that I would say is, I think Richard is right that if you look at our efforts that are place-based versus mobility, that there's an imbalance, that we have spent more on the place-based than we have on the mobility. And I think the notion that it's just easier is probably right. But I would also say that what that means for me is that you don't do any less on the place-based, because we haven't succeeded there either. We need to do more in both, no question about it, and it is costly. But I used to be the Secretary of Commerce and Trade for the Commonwealth of Virginia. We spend billions in this country on corporations in our efforts to move them to our places, instead of investing on developing the next Amazon in the Hudson Valley, right? And so it's not that we don't have the resources, it's how we spend them. It's who has the power to determine where we spend them. And so, I would keep pushing for both, with full acknowledgement that absolutely there has been an imbalance in the way we have attempted to do it, but that the ability to actually do both is there if we have the political will to follow through. Okay. And that's the real test of our character.
Okay. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, let me push back a little bit. Of course we should
That's what I wanted, by the way.
Yeah. Of course we should do more of everything. But there are a limited number of 9% credits available. And if we do more on the mobility side, we have to do less on the place-based side. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't do place-based investment. We need a lot of it. But if we're going to do both, it means facing the costs head-on. And I mean the choice, the policy costs, not the money costs, because resources are limited. Energy is limited. Time is limited. And we can't shift more emphasis on one without taking some emphasis off the other.
And we could do this all day. The point that I'm making is the pot that you have to pull from does not have to be mobility for place-based or place-based for mobility. Pull from the dollars you're giving to allow corporations to have no taxes whatsoever. That's what I'm suggesting. We're fighting over a small pot of money. That's the point that I'm making. There is a much larger pot of money that we should be advocating for and showing the value of. We are defeating ourselves when we think that our two options are we got to spend less on place-based or less on mobility. No, there are other places to spend more on both. This is a matter of power. Who has the power to move our public policy officials to spend money and where? That's what this is about. Because I have seen, and I'll be respectful because I was a public official, but I've seen lots of wasted dollars.
Well, I'm going to step in here on this one. And I wanted to ask...
Wait, I'm just getting started.
I wanted to ask one more question regarding public-private partnerships moving this integration work along. But I want to open it up for Q&A. Keep your questions short so we can get as many questions in as possible and then have a response.
I think this panel, I'm an advocate of fair housing. And I ran a fair housing group on Long Island, and we had an exclusionary zoning laws that were passed by the Supreme Court. So I think that, as a statement that maybe you can make comments about, I think that fair housing is critical because communities are segregated on purpose. Realtors, brokers are still segregating communities. And what we used to say to them is that segregation could get you your commission or could get your license. So there's no consequence. So communities are segregated, the economic disparities, the social things that go on, it really is still around race. The fair housing laws are continuously being fought on race. The majority of the cases are still based on race. And these communities that are still segregated, it still goes back to where are we going to sell your house and don't sell my house to this person. So I think we really have to go to a bottom line is let's talk about race. How do we stop realtors and people who are selling their houses to not say, I don't want you to sell to this person in my neighborhood? Because they're still segregated by choice. And so we have to decide in these communities, like you have a right to live wherever you want, but you don't have the right to choose your neighbors. And so until we begin to integrate our communities, our schools won't be integrated, we won't have economic parity, and so our children won't have the exposure to be with other children. So I think that integration in our communities are catalysts to changing these disparities, economic and racial disparities. So I just wanted to mention that I think that fair housing is critical, and we need to keep the fair housing laws.
If I could, I just want to quickly respond to that because I think it goes back to what Maurice just mentioned in terms of where resources are being spent. So again, the notion of you know who the protected classes are, the laws are on the books, but how are they being enforced? Start at the federal level. How much does the Department of Justice set aside for enforcement on fair housing? How much does HUD put for fair housing? Go down to the state of New York. How much is the state of New York investing in the Division of Human Rights or the Attorney General's office when it comes to fair housing? And then take it to the local level. So it really has to be a matter of how much are we willing to invest for that enforcement so that you can begin to make examples of those who are found discriminating. And unless and until we do that, again, you'll continue, as you mentioned, you'll continue to see the same patterns, whether it's race, whether it's disability, whether it's familial status, and those being usually, regardless of where you are, the top 3 discriminated or protected classes that are discriminated against across the state. And so it really comes to, I think, investment, the importance, again, going back to my presentation and how many municipalities, and here I believe all within your presentation are entitlement jurisdictions, how many of those entitlement jurisdictions are moving forward with an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice? Is it a priority?
Hi, thank you. My name's Allison Capella. I'm the new executive director of the Newburgh Land Bank. And my question regarding, it's regarding property taxes. I'm a former property tax certiorari attorney, and that's when you're dealing with property tax assessments. And I found it very interesting because it was the intersection of taxes and public policy and what tax exemptions are municipalities decide to enact. And so my question for mostly Mr. Rothstein, but whomever, is do you have any suggestions for property tax policy? Are there any other states that have creative tax policy? I just think it's really interesting. It's another tool that can be utilized and redistributing the pot of money. So I just would like maybe if someone could speak to that. Thank you.
Well, as I said, earlier, I think one of the tools we can use to prevent massive displacement as a result of gentrification is freezes on property taxes. That may seem wild to some of you, because if you know California's experience with Prop 13, you'll know that they enacted a policy like that in 1978, and the schools in California went from being among the best in the country to being the worst in the country. But that's not necessary. That's not a necessary consequence of a freeze in property taxes. You can freeze property taxes to preserve the right of homeowners in African American neighborhoods in particular to remain in their homes when their community gentrifies, and recoup the lost property taxes at point of sale so that the schools and public libraries and other public facilities don't suffer. So if you have a homeowner who bought a home for $50,000 20 years ago, and the homeowner continues to pay property taxes at the $50,000 rate for the time that she lives in it, but then 20 years later sells the home for $1 million, instead of getting $950,000 profit, she only gets $850,000 profit because the lost property taxes at that point are returned to the public treasury, and you don't have the Prop 13 consequence of California's freeze. So I think it's an important policy to, it's not talked about very much, but I think it's an important policy to advance, because when we talk about displacement from gentrifying communities, we're not just talking about renters. We're talking about large numbers of homeowners who are being displaced because they can't afford to pay property taxes on the homes that they may own outright and have lived in for many years. And the only solution to that, I think, is to freeze property taxes at the point of purchase.
I'll just note that if folks aren't aware of, I don't recall the exact bill numbers, but there's a bill in the Assembly and a same as bill in the Senate. It's particularly around community land trusts, but the notion is to provide tax relief to those homeowners that own within community land trusts. So there is activity that's taking place, and that's across the state. So statewide, I believe next week there is an information session in Albany that's another attempt to educate or further educate our elected officials about those particular bills. Specific to the city of New York, Assemblymember Rodriguez has a bill that's really targeting the tax relief that condo and co-op owners receive in the city of New York, and how those resources, if you just take the top 10%, how those resources can even help to strengthen NYCHA development. So there are some different activities that are taking place, current legislation across the state.
Hi, my name is Callie Jade. I'm the Executive Director of Rise Up Kingston. Thank you, everyone, for your words today. I wanted to bring it back to this concept of reparations, which in my mind is not just about money or throwing a check, but it is about the policies. And Richard, you mentioned that you believe one of the things that we could do to fix this is to allow Black folks to purchase homes at what $100,000, what they would have been able to, which I believe is a form of reparations, right? And we look at these facts that you're putting out and that many other people have put out. My question for all of you is, what is actually stopping us from moving away from just trying to change the policies that are disproportionately affecting Black and brown people to actually trying to create policies that are going to repair the harm that was done to Black and brown people? And how can we take the information from your book and encourage people to move to action on real reparations, things that will repair the harms that you've presented in your book so far? And anyone can answer that.
I'll try to answer it simply. Look, I think there are policy levers in the public sector as well as policy levers in the private sector. And I think in both cases you're talking about who's in power in the places that wield the power. That what's really stopping is more folks who are in authority to make these decisions who would prioritize fixing a problem like that. And that's in the public and the private sector, by the way, because in both places you've got you've got levers to make some significant change. But until we have more inclusion in our, and this means voting, by the way, right? At the end of the day, we're not helpless in this. This is us getting out and voting for public officials who want to prioritize these problems. And it also means shareholders of companies who can do something about this, also demanding that their boards and their executive leadership teams are doing what they do to be good corporate citizens. Until that happens on scale, it's tough to have these kinds of things to happen at scale. You see them here and there, right? But you can point to the leadership as the ultimate reason why these things get done. Who are your leaders?
And I would just add, as long as, and we're talking the external segregation that we see, but as long as the C-suite remains segregated from entry-level positions, I think you'll continue to see them.
Public and private.
Hi, my name is Mariel Fiori. I'm very interested about all of this conversation and learning a lot, and I wish I can read the book as fast as possible. I haven't heard much about Latinos or what has been the impact of discrimination against Mexican Americans. You know, like most of the South was part of Mexico before, and a lot of people would say that they didn't cross the border crossed them. However, the discrimination exists, and I was wondering if you talk about that in your book, about Latinos particularly, and if the panelists from your organizations, you can mention something. I was thinking also of the statistics you show about renters in cities like Kingston or other cities, and you put black renters, white renters, and I didn't see Latino renters, but they add up to 100. So where are Latinos within white, black? How do you portray them? So many questions related to what is your thought about Latinos?
No, I don't talk much about Latinos in my book because that's not the topic of the book. It's not that it's not important, but I didn't try to write about everything. I didn't talk about Native Americans either, which if anything, their extermination, the genocide against them, compares with, is worse than even what African Americans have experienced. When these policies that I've been focusing on that created the segregated patterns of this country were enacted in the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s and 60s, there were very, very few Latinos outside of California and Texas and Colorado and those southwestern states. So when the New Deal administrators were thinking about these policies and implementing them, they weren't thinking about Latinos. They were thinking about African Americans, and that's who the policies were directed against. It's certainly the case that Latinos suffered state-sponsored segregation in places like California and Texas, in particular, usually earlier than the African Americans did. And you can't, I'm not going to try to rank oppression. It's a serious problem. It needs to be addressed. But the patterns of segregation that were created in this country in most metropolitan areas were created at a time when there were very, very few Latinos living in these places. Puerto Ricans in New York, yes. But Mexican Americans were not living outside the Southwest in this country in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s to any significant extent. It's also the case that recent immigrants, whether Latino or Irish or Jewish or any recent immigrant group that is a low-wage group, settles in homogeneous low-income neighborhoods where their language is spoken, where they have job networks, which are necessary for their survival. I don't consider that segregation. Segregation is the enforced requirement that African Americans in particular in this country must live in neighborhoods and be excluded from the rest of the country. So far as Latinos who have been here for many generations, their experiences lie between those of non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. So if you look at data that analyze people by group, you find that the most advantaged people in this country are non-Hispanic whites, the least advantaged are African Americans, and Latinos lie somewhere in between. Finally, I'd say that the policies that are necessary to redress segregation would benefit Latinos as much as they would African Americans. Abolishing source of income discrimination, for example, is a policy that benefits both equally to the extent it opens up more opportunities for them. If we place more emphasis on where we place low-income housing tax credit developments, that would benefit Latinos as much as African Americans. So it's a complicated, mixture of different problems, but I don't really try to address it very much in my book, because that wasn't what the book was about. It's not that it's not important. Somebody else should write a book bringing to light the state-sponsored discrimination that Latinos have experienced.
Just in terms of the statistics, since the book was about white-black housing segregation, I just focused on those two groups. Certainly, if you look at the other category, for sure in Middletown and Poughkeepsie, I would guess that it's almost all Latinx populations. And when we release the full report, we'll definitely be looking at all the different groups, and I'll run those just for you, Maria, and I'll send it to you.
It's time for 2 more questions, right?
Hi, I'm Mandy Kelso. I'm from TD Bank, and this has just been such a pleasure. It hurts my heart to know the truth about our history, but I think it's very healing for everyone in the room to know that we're working on it, at least facing it. My question actually revolves around the Community Reinvestment Act. I'm thinking about the ways that segregation was codified over decades, even probably now in different areas. And right now the CRA Act is being reviewed for modification, as we all know. And I've sat in a lot of different, strategy sessions or thinking about how it should be changed. And affirmative action, right? Because it doesn't address race, right? And a lot of people believe that it should. In a way, it's desegregating, if you think about the wealth disparity that you spoke about, and making sure that banks are investing in places of color, even though, that's not what we're calling it. It kind of is what it is, right? So I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on, how we could modernize it to help undo some of the damage that have been done by these laws in your book, and I'm really excited about reading your book.
You want to?
You can if you want.
Okay.
I'll follow you. Yeah.
All right. So let me just, we are very engaged in the efforts around modernizing CRA. One of the pieces of feedback I've given to the regulators is we need now, this bumps up against all kinds of federal law. So let me stipulate that. But we got into this issue because banks, bless you, were redlining on the basis of race, not on the basis of low and moderate income communities. They were redlining on the basis of, as Richard said, black folks. And so my view is that as you're thinking about modernizing CRA, you should be putting more incentives in CRA to invite banks to invest in black and brown communities. Specifically, not just that, but specifically. I also believe you've got to give banks more incentives to invest in rural America as well. But on your point, it is, in my mind, now I understand why, because this would bump up against federal prohibitions around explicitly race-based initiatives. And so we've got to figure this out, but more incentives for banks to be investing in the communities that are actually the motivating factor or the motivating fact base for CRA, meaning communities of color, explicitly Black communities, is what I believe that we should be wrestling with in the context of CRA modernization. That's not happening right now. The nomenclature is low and moderate income communities. My anticipation is that's what will be the case moving forward. And then there's some other things, but on your particular point, I'm in agreement with you.
Hi, my name's John Capello. I'm a land use attorney. I've been practicing for 30 years. I've brought a successful exclusionary zoning case in the region, and also have written inclusionary zoning laws that were adopted in the area, but can, soon as a project actually comes in, that will comply with them. And I'm also the president of a local anti-poverty organization. I've been out in the field for 30 years, and unfortunately, what my experience is when it comes to zoning and providing and addressing some of the exclusionary zonings and providing an array of opportunities for all types of people, or providing job opportunities at all wage scales, the people who are out there opposing most of these aren't the bigots that we talked about earlier. They're my fellow white liberals who are against any type of development, and I don't think it's black, white, or red, it's green. They want a certain income level in their community. Even in our cities, when you have projects coming in the cities, the people who are the most recent residents who came in, who are gentrifying, are the opposition to those. So how do we educate those people to provide those opportunities? Because I frankly think it's those people who are doing a better job segregating our community than some of the so-called bigots we know have done over the course of the years. So how do we look in our own hearts to decide that we need to do a better job promoting this, instead of just looking at the outside or looking at the federal government and looking at the 1940s? It's what are we doing today in our communities to promote this?
That's a fun one.
I don't really have a response to it. That's what we need to do. That's why we need a new civil rights movement, to do exactly that. I'm not talking about changing the hearts and minds of people in the 1940s.
The only thing I would add is, so we're working in San Francisco now, and San Francisco prides itself on progressivity.
A smug, self-satisfied place.
Richard just finished my comment, which is, I have never, the opposition that we are getting to the NIMBYism there is no different from NIMBYism that we are seeing anywhere else in the country. So your point is right on, which is that this is an issue that nobody's wearing their white hat on.
This is one of the things that I wanted to comment on. Is all of this segregation, for years, this segregation has segregated us so much that we're so unfamiliar with each other that what's happened is that we become fearful of each other. That's what segregation does. It doesn't expose anyone to our different cultures, to who we really are. We are people who have many common likes. We have more in common than what we have that we don't have in common. We are human beings. So the years of segregation has done so much damage. That's really what you're really up against. You're up against fear. All of us. Even me. I can tell you that I was fearful, and I'm becoming less fearful. I'm swallowing my fear because I want us to be integrated.
Right. And The challenge here is how do people believe that moving the ball forward in integration is in their best interest for the whole NIMBYism issue. So that's the challenge, right? If you're talking about my property values and how I'm going to educate my kids, how are we going to do this integration thing? That's the question. I don't have the answer, but it's not an overnight thing. It's sort of what I've learned with this race, equity, diversity, and inclusion work that I do. It's messy work. It's not easy. There's fear. So the one way I look at it, and I don't know if this is doable, is there a regional approach to providing housing in areas that may not be explicitly, directly in those communities where opportunity may exist, but on the periphery or within the region, there are opportunities maybe better than some of the highly distressed communities. Is there a way to get at it a little bit on a regional approach? It's absorbed regionally as opposed to in a particular community. And that's just one thought. I know we have to wrap.
I think that's a great call to action, and start with Kevin and Guy to start the conversation with the municipalities.
Right.
So folks, please join me in giving this panel a great round of applause. I know that I am deeply indebted to the men and women on this stage who have traveled great miles and great personal journeys to be here today, to participate in this conversation, which is what that is and what this is. And so to each of you I say thank you, and in particular to Mr. Rothstein, whose book has impacted me greatly. You have impressed me today as well. Thank you for galvanizing this conversation around the country. So thank you. So I'll just add one last thing before we go out and have an opportunity. There's wine and cheese and soft drinks out there waiting for you. There's book signing waiting for you. I thank each of you for the miles that you traveled today to come here, for the personal journeys that have brought you here today to participate in this conversation. I believe that there are forces out there who want to split us apart. This is a conversation that calls for changing of hearts and minds, calls for mobilization. We need to find the political will to do some of the policies that Richard points out we sort of know. And so in that journey of trying to move forward, to mobilize, to advocate, to come together, people are going to want to split us. We're unfamiliar, not familiar enough. And I urge you to not allow the forces to split us, but to come together. We are allies. We have allies outside of this room that are not with us today. And there's many places where you can go with this conversation, you're not going to be well received. Here, you know, out there with a glass of wine, we're gonna connect. But other places, maybe not so. And you got to turn back to your allies. Don't let them split us. Let's come together. It's a big task, but it's ours. This is our time. So let's have at it. Once again, thank you from our panelists. We'll see you outside. Book signing, little wine and cheese. Thank you all very much.